Hello class, welcome to this first of a two-part lecture on Antigone and philosophy, the first one titled Something to Do with Dionysus. We'll start by giving an overview of Simon Critchley's philosophy of tragedy, see how it offers an alternative approach to Goose, which we studied last week. We'll then turn to the Antigone itself in various interpretations, especially Bernard Knox and Hölderlin's interpretation, before finally looking more closely into the role of the god Dionysus in the play itself. The second lecture, Antigone and Philosophy 2, will be on Heidegger's Antigone, subtitled The Uncanny That Here and Now Appears. So let's start by introducing Simon Critchley. You'll find in the modules a PDF of the first third of his recent book, Tragedy, the Greeks and Us. Critchley is a contemporary, prolific public philosophy professor, currently the Hans Jonas Professor at the New School for Social Research, and the series moderator for The Stone, the philosophy column of the New York Times. While not a classicist, he began studying philosophy and literature at the University of Essex, where he eventually earned a PhD and went on to a pretty high-profile academic career. He's written an enormous amount, but his 2019 book, Tragedy, the Greeks and Us, is maybe his best. One thing you'll note when reading Critchley is that he makes learning about tragedy a lot less esoteric and arcane than did Gu or other sources we've read so far. He also nowhere cites Gu's book, Oedipus Philosopher. From the short work he makes of the views on tragedy in Heidegger or the early Nietzsche, we might imagine that he would consider Gu's book not very interesting or helpful. Even a sorry example of what he calls philosophy's tragedy, which occurs when a philosopher lamentably constructs a canon within a canon, which then authorizes their barely paying attention to the text, while at the same time falsifying ancient and modern cultural contexts. For Critchley, tragedy's own philosophy is opposed to what he calls philosophy's tragedy. In his injunction that we should slow down in order to fully absorb tragic thought in the plays themselves, Critchley is animated by disappointment with the dominant philosophies of tragedy since Schelling to the Heideggerians. Quote, "The concept of the tragic undergoes a spectacular inflation in the Germanophone world at the end of the 18th century. The tragic becomes the name for that domain of experience in which an intellectual intuition of the whole is still possible." More trenchantly, he is opposed to an idealized exoticism of the Greeks as a way of criticizing the nihilism of modernity, i.e. Heidegger's reading, which he sees as in line with a conservative culture critique that always carries with it a crypto-authoritarian fantasy of order and blind submission. If only a god can save us, as Heidegger said in the Der Spiegel interview, then we know, deep down, there is no such thing. Salvation is the wrong concept when it comes to thinking through and assessing the value of human life, end quote. We can see from this that Critchley is going to steer our thinking of tragedy away from the religious domain. His view of the lessons which tragedy teaches us are more secular or even skeptical. The purpose of tragedy is not sort of Dionysian redemption or catharsis, but a political and aesthetic situating of modern life, always within contradictory and irreconcilable demands. Critchley traces the German metaphysical ideal of the tragic back to Plato's criticism of tragedy, with its commitment to the idea and the ideal of a non-contradictory psychic life. For him, this ideal may be desirable, but it is unrealizable. Philosophy's tragedy begins with Plato and takes place when philosophy acts a bit like Oedipus, as if it knew what it did not know, attempting to authorize the truth in the name of reconciliation or salvation. Philosophy's tragedy begins in earnest in modernity with Schelling's idea of the tragic, which is, quote, based exclusively on a rather particular reading of Sophocles' Oedipus the King. Indeed, Schelling presents us with a very philosophical Oedipus, who is torn between the objective power of necessity and the determination to fight freely against the fate that threatens to consume him. To counter this tradition, Critchley sees himself as attending to all the texts of Greek tragedy, something we can't do here, in order to discover the situational dialectic which each of the plays reveal. He mercilessly criticizes, even makes fun of philosophers who take only Oedipus and Antigone or a few tragedies as exemplary, or worse, those who, like Heidegger, take bits and pieces of these tragedies out of context in order to invent some new bit of philosophy. The value of tragedy is not the speculative metaphysics we can extract from it, but the fact that it forces us to slow down and acknowledge life's complexities. And so Critchley asks, quote, What if we took seriously the form of thinking that we find in tragedy and the experience of partial agency, limited autonomy, deep traumatic affect, agonistic conflict, gender confusion, political complexity, and moral ambiguity it presents? Might that yield to us tragedy's philosophy as an alternative to philosophy's tragedy? The figure of Antigone first appears in Critchley's book in section 4, Rage, Grief, and War, Tragedy's Impetus. Here he cites Anne Carson, a constant interlocutor in his book, in her translations of Euripides' Grief Lessons, where she asks, why does tragedy exist? Because you are full of rage. And why are you full of rage? Because you are full of grief. This applies to many figures in Greek tragedies, but especially to Antigone, who rages because she is full of grief for her brother Polynices, who is refused burial by the leader of the city, Creon. Critchley adds a further question to Carson's, if tragedy is the rage that follows from grief, then why is one full of grief? He answers, because we are full of war, and people have been killed. Tragedy might be defined as a grief-stricken rage that flows from war. And Critchley points out how more than half of our surviving tragedies were composed after the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War in 431 BCE. Oedipus the King was first performed in 429 BCE, 2 years after the beginning of the war, during a time of plague that is estimated to have killed 1/4 of the Athenian population. The plague that established the entire environment of Sophocles' play is not some idle musing. It was very real indeed. And this is why, as we saw in Oedipus' Tyrannus, the chorus prays for the plague to end by routing the god Ares, the god of war himself. And here Critchley adds another crucial observation. Not only are all Greek tragedies about combat veterans, they were also performed by combat veterans. We won't have time here to get into each of Critchley's 12 theses on tragedy, and it's hard not to agree with most if not all of them, although a few might require some qualification. Let's focus here on just these 4. 1. Tragedy is an invention at once political, literary, and anthropological, taking place at the level of subjectivity. 2. Tragedy is not the expression of a religiously legitimized ritual. It is rather a meta-ritual or an institution premised upon a temporal disjunction, specifically the disjunction of past and present. The time of tragedy, ancient and modern, is always out of joint. The 8th thesis picks up Critchley's de-emphasizing of the role of Greek religion in tragedy. The tragic coupling of the human and the divine that is all over tragedy is not some pre-modern remnant, some supernatural or superstitious residue. And it is not to be explained through an evolutionary narrative that culminates in the achievement of autonomy where we legislate for ourselves. And then the 9th thesis, the significance of tragedy cannot be explained away through some either progressivist philosophy of history, Hegel, Marx, or through a regressivist conception, Nietzsche, Heidegger. I think we can agree with each of these 4 theses, but I would like to, in a moment, qualify my agreement with the 9th. Where is Critchley coming from? Critchley's interpretation of tragedy is coming from his critique of the Dionysus-Centrism we find in so many philosophies of tragedy since Nietzsche. This emphasis on the Dionysian tends to paint a picture of the Attic Greeks as exotic others. And so he asks, are the Greeks really so unlike us? And goes on, there is a widespread view, let's call it early Nietzschean, that I bought hook, line, and sinker as an undergraduate in the 1980s. On this view, tragedy arises out of ritual, religious ritual, specifically in honor of the god Dionysus. Now both Aristotle in his Poetics and Nietzsche agree on this point, although they employ it for very different ontological ends. Critchley doesn't exactly declare this view wrong, but he expresses his skepticism. Pre-ritualist, usually Dionysian readings of tragedy, especially when it turns into the, quote, fantasy of the ecstatic Greeks, the exotic, othered, god-languishing Greeks, the Greeks imagined by thinkers like Heidegger, and even more so by Heideggerians. To counter the Heideggerian view of Greek tragedy, which we'll turn to in the next lecture, Critchley sides with a more modern trend among interpreters, which in fact goes back to a very ancient remark of Plutarch. What does this specific tragedy have to do with the god Dionysus? And Critchley comments, quote, of the 31 tragedies that we possess from the 5th century BCE, only one has anything to do with Dionysus. Obviously, Euripides' late play, the Bacchae, and it is, to say the very least, a complex case. Looking back to the birth of tragedy, Critchley asks, are Ajax or Agamemnon or Prometheus, in fact, merely masks for Dionysus, the dying, suffering god of resurrection, as Nietzsche suggests? For Critchley, this is a tempting, seductive theory, but there is absolutely no reason to accept it, and the fact that it is tempting perhaps says more about our intellectual weakness for generalized etiological explanations than the theory's strength. Qualifying his Dionysus skepticism, Critchley doesn't really mind if we approach tragedy as ritual, as any anthropologist would have to do, but he is concerned about regressivist interpretations that view tragic rituals in terms of nostalgia for some, quote, fantasy of a precognitive, pre-conscious, trance-like sacral automatism. If we can speak of tragedy as an inauthentic ritual, then Critchley has no problem with it. And even if tragedy did emerge from Dionysian ritual, Critchley wants to underline the fallacy of thinking that we have thereby somehow explained tragedy by evoking its genealogy. Quote, tragedy might have had a religious origin, but one is entitled to ask, so what? Many things have a religious origin, like major European universities, the legal profession, and the institutionalized pedophilia of the Catholic Church. But that doesn't entail that their activity must be defined in relation to its origin and confined within it. Critchley seems to have a very strong distaste for contemporary forms of institutional religion throughout this book, and it does make us wonder whether the secular vision of ancient Greek tragedy that he proposes emerges at least in part from his own atheist projections. Critchley is interested in tragedy as an ethicist, and what he finds from the point of view of our ethical lives is that ancient and modern subjectivity are not really that distinct. There are indeed two trends in the scholarship here, one which would see the world of Attic tragedy and the Greek miracle as utterly foreign and alienating to our modern sensibilities, something closer to the archaic past than our own present, and the other which insists on precisely the opposite. That is the relative closeness of Sophocles' world and ours in historical time depth, perhaps even to the point of closing the distance between the ancient Greek and the modern experience of these tragedies, and claiming that we experience them pretty much the same way as the ancient Greeks did, a view proposed by Bernard Knox. However we resolve this dispute of ancient versus modern, it's clear to me at least that Critchley is vastly underestimating the presence of the god Dionysus in the tragedies we have. For example, almost every choral song in the three tragedies we're studying do evoke the god Dionysus. We can argue about whether Dionysus appears in tragedy as merely a cultural residue, but he is still strongly present in tragedy. And the question is, why? It doesn't seem that Critchley is very interested in this question. What is the Dionysian context of ancient Greek tragedy telling us? Throughout Critchley's book, there is a strong dismissal of Christianity, even of anything remotely religious. While he says he prefers polytheism to monotheism, he seems to have little interest in either, at one point remarking that the gods of Attic tragedy are simply a, quote, placeholder for a force or for that which exceeds yet determines and can destroy human agency. The gods are simply unknown, rather than possible sites of actual revelation. And this can help us qualify our agreement with Critchley's ninth thesis. If we understand an excessive emphasis on the religious dimension of Greek tragedy as regressivist, then we would have to agree with Critchley that the early Nietzsche and most of Heidegger's philosophy of tragedy is just this. First of all, does anyone in either the progressivist or regressivist camp here really want to explain away the significance of tragedy to solve its riddle, as it were? Of course, any 21st century reader has to agree that there are abundant regressivist, authoritarian, anti-modern, essentialist, Protestant-style, reactivated, pure and primal source elements in Nietzsche's and Heidegger's accounts of tragedy. For example, in the early Nietzsche's Back to the Dionysian Future, or Heidegger's Back to the Pre-Socratic Future, with its indigenous Greek Dasein. The problem here is that we cannot claim the regressivist ideologies that we do find in the early Nietzsche or Heidegger's accounts of tragedy exhaust the value of their insights, and Critchley does not think that Hegel even believed in his progressivist thesis. All this makes me wonder what Critchley would make of John Joseph Gou's book. As we saw in the previous series on Oedipus and philosophy, Gou identifies the Hegelian Marxist progressivist and Nietzschean Heideggerian regressivist accounts of tragedy much as does Critchley. Both are concerned with the meaning of tragedy and the Greeks for us. If Critchley does have a distaste for Gou's book, it might be because Gou retains a much stronger emphasis via the Cambridge Ritual School on the historic mythic structures and religious experience that possibly underlie tragedy. Or it could be all the rogue psychoanalysis that Gou indulges in. I imagine that for Critchley, Gou would also be dismissed above all in his tendency to affirm the lamentable for him notion of a canon within a canon. It's true that Gou excessively generalizes about philosophy's tragedy, and his relentless focus on Oedipus's archaic prehistory and his intellectual afterlife in the history of philosophy certainly overwhelm Sophocles' own text and overdetermine it, with many meanings that simply cannot be found there. Despite this flaw, Gou's interpretation is not, strictly speaking, either progressivist or regressivist, but it may have too many elements of both approaches for Critchley's taste. As Critchley puts this, problems arise whenever we generalize about the tragic. Quote, I think we should be cautious about the philosophical habit of generalizing about the tragic, namely that one or two tragedies might be discussed by a philosopher, usually Sophocles' Oedipus the King and the Antigone, as we're doing here, and not in any particular textual detail, and on that basis a whole number of ontological, moral, and historical assumptions are proffered. Could this be considered an indirect critique of books like Gou's? I think so. And Critchley goes on, it is worth recalling that there are 31 extant tragedies, and it is not that difficult or time-consuming to read them all. And my experience is that the more one reads, the less easy it becomes to generalize about the tragic, especially when one absorbs all the plays by Euripides. Evoking the authority of Walter Benjamin, Critchley wants to argue that all talk about the tragic as something universally human is vain, and that this is particularly the case when thinkers like Heidegger wax lyrical about the essence of Greek Dasein, Greek being there on the basis of a highly partial and selective reading of the Antigone. Now, it's a bit odd that despite these provisos and self-advertisements, when it suits Critchley, he continues to invoke the Dionysian contexts of tragedy, such as on page 52, on Dionysus Eleutherios, the liberator. Yet he does so always within an insistence on tragedy's aesthetic innovations and self-conscious modernization. Following Vernon and Vidal-Naquet, Critchley shows how tragedy is democracy turning itself into spectacle, how it's fundamentally different from preceding genres such as the epic and the lyric, in which many of the myths of tragedy are first expressed, and above all, tragedy is the development, maybe the word invention is too strong here, of tragic consciousness. The question we inherit from Nietzsche's and Hölderlin's engagement with Greek tragedy is precisely this: how much does the tragic consciousness have to do with the god Dionysus? Plutarch's ancient question, what has it to do with Dionysus, is answered by Critchley in a deflationary mode, and skepticism re religious origins or ritual experiences prevails. What tragedy shows us is aesthetic modernity. Now, given that we only have 5 weeks on Sophocles in this course, we can't yet take up Critchley's challenge to incorporate all the evidence for the appearances of Dionysus in our 32 extant tragedies. But for all he worries about philosophers' excessive specialization on Sophocles' Antigone and Oedipus Tyrannus, they are still suitable test cases for the question of the relevance of Dionysus to Greek tragedy. Is Dionysus relevant for understanding these plays or not? And it's this question that I would like to explore in this lecture through a focused reading of the Antigone. First, a little review for those of you who are already hazy on where we started at the beginning of this series. Classical tragedy came into its own over and against its origins during the period of Athenian imperial democracy and lavish public spending by Pericles on public festivals. The most famous and popular of these festivals was the city Dionysia, during the beginning of spring, at which the god Dionysus was honored with the performance of dithyrambics, tragedies, and comedies. In fact, Dionysus' statue was brought out to observe the plays, and seats of honor were reserved for the priests, One surviving seat reads, reserved for the priest of Dionysus. We've also heard how Dionysus is a popular rather than an aristocratic god, and his presence in the theater also suggests a role for him in popular democracy, what Plato calls theatrocratia, or rule by the theater. Bernard Knox insists that theatrical performances took place in a, quote, sacramental area, a place where divine forces were invoked and put to work, where the performance was, for actors and audience alike, an act of worship. If this is so, it may not be a question of whether Greek theater was more political or more religious. It could have been both. Ecstatic possession and temporary loss of individual identity under the influence of Dionysus is far from inconsistent with the modernized political aesthetics of theater. While the function of the chorus changed over time, it did continue to reflect the Dionysian origins of theater as a genre, and invoked, at least in the plays we're studying, Dionysus at most critical moments in the action. So that being a general introduction to Critchley on tragedy, and to the critical question I want to pose about Dionysus in this lecture, what do Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus and especially Antigone have to do with Dionysus? Let's turn now to a close reading of Sophocles' Antigone play, before returning to this issue of the role of Dionysus in the play at the end. A 1797 classical dictionary, which George Steiner quotes at the outset of his amazing Antigones, the Antigone myth in Western literature, art, and thought, gives us a great entry on this drama. Antigone, a daughter of Oedipus, king of Thebes, by his mother Jocasta. She buried by night her brother Polynices against the positive orders of Creon, who, when he heard of it, ordered her to be buried alive. She, however, killed herself before the sentence was executed. Haemon, the king's son, who was passionately fond of her, and who had not been able to obtain her pardon, killed himself on her grave. The death of Antigone is the subject of one of the tragedies of Sophocles. The Athenians were so pleased with it at the first representation that they presented the author with the government of Samos. The tragedy was represented 32 times at Athens without interruption. Antigone was simply the most popular Greek tragedy that ever was, according to our testimonial sources. And although chronologically we're doing it now as the third of Sophocles' Theban plays, scholars agree that it was written first, probably in about 442 to 441 BCE. As Steiner notes at the outset of his book, which unfortunately we don't have time to get into here, it's also the most popular modern tragedy, at least from 1790 to 1905, and increasingly so in the present day. It's been widely held by European poets, philosophers, and scholars that it's not only the finest of Greek tragedies, but a work of art nearer to perfection than any other produced by the human spirit. The basic plot summary of Sophocles' version of this mythic material goes a bit like this. Denial of burial to Oedipus' son, Polynices, by Creon. Antigone's refusal to submit and renegade burial of her brother, with Ismene initially declining to participate. Various scenes leading to Antigone's crime being discovered, her avowing it, and her being buried alive on Creon's orders. Tiresias warning Creon that he has made a mistake and committed a sacrilege, but it's too late. The suicide scene of Antigone in her tomb. Haemon, Creon's son, and the fiancé of Antigone, a bit like a woe-bestricken Romeo, attacking his father and killing himself in the tomb after discovering Antigone dead, and then Eurydice, Creon's wife, killing herself at the loss of her son, and concluding with Creon acknowledging his mistakes and going into exile, a bit like Oedipus. As Lattimore and Green summarize the themes of the play and its reinvention in the 20th century, quote, the idea of building a tragic plot around the bold and defiant resistance of Oedipus's daughter to Creon's authority, out of loyalty to her brother, seems to have originated with this play. Sophocles' heroine has been taken as a model of individual resistance to totalitarian rule, and or as a martyr to the cause of the family, or religion, or women's rights. The composers Arthur Honegger and Karl Orff, and the playwright Bertolt Brecht, all create adaptations of Antigone. John Anouilh's drama Antigone and Athol Fugard's The Island offer contrasting but equally brilliant versions of Sophocles' original. Likewise, the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan and the philosopher Judith Butler, we could add here, Zizek, and many others. Meanwhile, Sophocles' play itself continues to stand out as one of the 3 or 4 most widely performed, read, discussed, and admired of all Greek tragedies. Sophocles' Antigone is certainly a political play. In approaching the question of who was right, Antigone or Creon, Antigone is often said to stand for the law of kinship, as a rebel and martyr, and Creon for the law of the city, as a tyrant and patriarch. But nothing about the Antigone, as we'll see, is entirely straightforward. In Jean Anouilh's 1944 version, Antigone comes to represent the French resistance, and Creon, the practical Nazi, who desires to rule fairly but firmly, thus restoring order to a chaotic situation. Because of Anouilh's more or less balanced presentation of these two positions, both French and German audience members were able to greet the play with applause in occupied Paris. In Brecht's 1948 version, Creon is the Nazi aggressor and Antigone the unambiguous heroine. Our own postmodern tendency is more similar to this. We tend to identify fully with Antigone and cast Creon in the role of a villainous tyrant. This intuition regarding the tyranny of Creon is not incorrect, but we should not forget that Sophocles took pains to initially present Creon in a favorable light as a true patriot. Similarly, Antigone is not free of her dark side. The play possibly presents her as driven by an incestuous motivation, and certainly as inconsistent. The chorus, usually the voice of neutrality in the unfolding of the action, only expresses sympathy for Antigone when she is led off to her death, and they only switch sides to Creon after the oracle of Tiresias is pronounced. The famous hymn to Man, which we'll get into in more detail, and which is about celebrating civilization and order, clearly sides with Creon against Antigone's, quote, reckless daring. Most famous in the play from the point of view of philosophical interpretation is Antigone's claim to act on behalf of an eternal and unwritten law and the unshakable traditions of the gods. And Tiresias, the blind prophet, upholds her claim that divine law does prescribe burial for all dead men. And yet Antigone has personal motives too. As Knox puts this, she proclaims again and again to her sister Ismene, as to her opponent Creon, the duty she owes her brother to the family relationship. This makes sense in terms of the Greek custom that mourning the dead was especially a duty and privilege of women. There may be a lot more going on here. As Knox goes on, the political aspect of Antigone's loyalty is emphasized in Creon's inaugural address. Whoever places a friend, the Greek word philos, which can mean relative, above the good of his country, he is nothing. And it is not as if we can divide divine versus human law simply along the lines of Antigone versus Creon. For Creon also believes he is upholding a divine law, the law of Zeus of the city, Uranian Zeus, versus the Chthonic Zeus of family worship, Zeus Homaimos. Both Antigone and Creon evoke inviolable religious principles. It's one divine law here versus another, as in Aeschylus's Oresteia. Antigone, in fact, makes two politico-religious appeals, the bond of kindred blood and the unwritten law of the gods prescribing burial. Creon also makes two politico-religious appeals, the bond of the community under positive law and the blessing on this law of the gods who sustain it. The tragic outcome for both may be that in advocating for opposing divine laws, Antigone and Creon are also driven by purely personal motives, and both fall to hypocrisy. Another somewhat out of left field reading of the political context of the play we can find in Catherine Rosenfield's book, Antigone, Sophocles' Art and Hölderlin's Insight. According to her reading of Hölderlin, Antigone is a story of a particular political conflict, not just a drama about universal ethical or theological dilemmas. Rosenfield reads Hölderlin's revolutionary Antigone in terms of a political intrigue. Creon is the usurper monarch, and Antigone is the rightful heiress of Thebes by epikleros, a law prescribing inheritance from the father. The oldest surviving female relative, in the case where there is no suitable male heir, and her son was in Athenian law and elsewhere subject to unique rules of marriage, and her son continued the line of the father, not that of the husband. If there had been a son of Antigone and Haemon, in other words, he would have been a prince in the line of the Labdacids, Oedipus's line, rather than Creon's. If this is the case, why don't we find any mention of Antigone as an epikleros in Sophocles' play? According to Rosenfield, Sophocles did not need to stress this because it was obvious to his audience. It's true that the chorus hopes at one point that Antigone and Haemon's son will continue the line of the Labdacids. And it's also true that Creon would have every reason to prevent this from happening. Hence the edict that no one should bury Polynices is a trap for Antigone. Also, Creon declares the deaths of Polynices and Eteocles, the two brothers who had been at war with each other, as, quote, joint mutual suicides. Accordingly, the edict against burial of Polynices, if not clearly a trap, is at the very least hypocritical. Greek law did allow for the burial of enemies, but outlawed honor for suicides. On this reading, Creon's motives are at once political, fear of extinction of his line, and communal, his desire to finally give Thebes pollution-free rulers. With Antigone out of the way and a new dynasty, Haemon's sons will bear his name, not that of the accursed Labdacids. Rosenfield also finds support for this unusual interpretation in the dialogue between Creon and the guard. Here Creon is extremely patient, but the guardsman is not the simpleton he appears to be. And so Creon offers a deal: help find the guilty party or face conviction on the charge of bribery and negligence. Rosenfield asks, is this a kind of dirty dealing, an injunction that the guardsman should provide Antigone as a scapegoat and thereby support the usurper ruler? Also, Creon initially wants to execute Ismene as well, i.e. eliminate the line of the Labdacids altogether, although there is no evidence of her involvement. The whole thing smacks for Rosenfield of a political setup. Does Antigone walk into the trap with open eyes as a struggle for her very being in its heroic lineage? This is an interesting way of reading the political action in the Antigone, but it's not very well supported by the standard reading of the text, so let's turn to that now. Bernard Knox explains Creon's motives and character arc. At first, he's presented as having a noble character and favorability ratings to his audience, but this quickly dissipates as the play proceeds. Creon's announcement of his decision to expose the corpse, the concluding section of his speech, is couched in violent, vindictive terms. Carrion for the birds and the dogs to tear, which stand in shocking contrast to the ethical generalities that precede it. This hint of a cruel disposition underlying the statesman-like facade is broadened by the threat of torture leveled at the sentry and the order to execute Antigone in the presence of Haemon, her betrothed. And as he meets resistance from a series of opponents, Antigone's contemptuous defiance, the rational political advice of his son Haemon, the imperious summons to obedience of the god's spokesman, Tiresias, Creon swiftly abandons the temperate rhetoric of his inaugural address for an increasingly savage invective. Against the two sanctions imposed by Antigone, the demands of blood relationship, the rights and privileges of the gods below, Creon rages in terms ranging from near blasphemous defiance to scornful mockery. Continuing with Knox's introduction, Creon is forced to recognize at last the strength of those social and religious imperatives that Antigone obeys. His claim to be representative of the whole community, like Oedipus's claim at the beginning of his drama, is forgotten as he refuses to accept Haemon's report that the citizens, though they dare not speak out, disapprove of his actions. He denies the relevance of such a report, even if true, and finally repudiates his principles in specific terms by an assertion that the city belongs to him. The city is the king's, that's the law. This autocratic phrase puts the finishing touch to the picture Sophocles is drawing for his audience. Creon has now displayed all the characteristics of the tyrant, a despotic ruler who seizes power and retains it by intimidation and force. The blind prophet Tiresias tells him that the birds and dogs are fouling the altars of the city's gods with the carrion flesh of Polynices. He must bury the corpse. His furious reply begins with a characteristic accusation, also in Oedipus Rex, that the prophet has been bribed. The sentry earlier had the same accusation flung at him, but what follows is a hideously blasphemous defiance of those gods Creon once claimed to serve. According to Knox, right before Creon changes his tune, he is sustained by nothing except his tyrannical insistence on his own will, come what may, and his outraged refusal to be defeated by a woman. No woman, he says, is going to lord it over me. I am not the man, not now. She is the man if this victory goes to her and she goes free. Antigone, for her part, is just as indifferent to Creon's principles of action as he is to hers. She mentions the city only in her last agonized laments before she is led off to her living death. In all her arguments with Creon and Ismene, she speaks as one wholly unconscious of the rights and the duties membership in the city confers and imposes, as if no larger unit than the family existed. It is a position just as extreme as Creon's insistence that the demands of the city take precedence over all others for the living and the dead alike. And so there is more than a little truth in Creon's mocking comment that Hades is the one god she worships. She is from the beginning much possessed by death. Together with Ismene, she is the last survivor of a doomed family, burdened with such sorrow that she finds life hardly worth living. Who on earth, she says to Creon, alive, in the midst of so much grief as I, could fail to find in death a rich reward? On the relationship of Antigone to the gods Hades and Zeus, Knox goes on to point out how she looks forward to her reunion with her beloved dead in the dark kingdom where Persephone, the bride of Hades, welcomes the ghosts. It is in the name of Hades, one of the three great gods who rule the universe, that she defends the right of Polynices and of all human beings to proper burial. Death, she says, Hades longs for the same rights for all. In Creon's gods, the city's patrons and defenders, she shows no interest at all. Zeus she mentions twice, once as the source of all the calamities that have fallen and are still to fall on the house of Oedipus, and once again at the beginning of her famous speech about the unwritten laws. But the context here suggests that she is thinking about Zeus in his special relationship to the underworld, Zeus Chthonios, or underworld Zeus. It wasn't Zeus, she says, who made this proclamation, nor did justice, dwelling with the gods beneath the earth, ordain such laws for men. Her religious devotion and duty are holy to the world below. Much like Creon, she ends by denying the great sanctions she invoked to justify her action. In Creon's case, the process was spread out over the course of several scenes as he reacted to each fresh pressure that was brought to bear on him. Antigone turns her back on the claims of blood relationship and the nether gods in one sentence. 3 lines in the Greek, no more. They are the emotional high point of the speech she makes just before she is led off to her death. Quote, "Never, I tell you, if I had been the mother of children, or if my husband had died, exposed and rotting, I'd have never taken this ordeal upon myself, never defied our people's will." Earlier, Antigone had argued for a divine unwritten law which specifies the same rights for all, but now she confesses her purely personal motivations. She would not have broken the law for husband or child, who are fully replaceable, but only for her blood brother Polynices, since their parents being dead, he is irreplaceable. If this line isn't to be taken as spurious, then Antigone's rejection of her public values, privileging family and what we owe the dead, is just as complete. But, and this has often been argued, it's also the sudden product of a lonely and brooding introspection, or last-minute assessment of her motives, over which the imminence of death confers a merciless clarity. This inconsistency in Antigone's character has led many scholars and dramatists to refuse these lines. For example, Goethe writes to his friend Eckermann in 1827, "I would give a great deal if some talented scholar could prove that these lines were interpolated, not genuine. For without these lines, Antigone goes to her prison tomb with no flicker of self-doubt, the flawless champion of a family bond and the divine unwritten laws." Alas, however, the evidence moves against any flawless, unambiguous valorization of Antigone in the play, and we find Antigone's speech on the irreplaceability of the brother versus the replaceability of husband and child also discussed in Aristotle. alongside her inconsistency, scholars have also found, hovering on the surface of the text itself, something like Antigone's incestuous desire for her brother. For at the beginning, in her dialogue with Ismene, she speaks of loving her brother so much that she wants to lie with him in the grave. Thigh to thigh in the grave, as Anne Carson glosses, or so you, Antigone, say early in the play, but no one mentions it again afterwards. In her final soliloquy, on the brink of death, she speaks to Polynices directly. She says that she would not have given her life for anyone but a brother. It is as if she already left the world of the living and joined that community of the dead family she speaks of with such love. These lines support Hegel's emphasis on the pure brother-sister love as the preeminent and privileged form of love, which defines the substance of ethical life. They also suggest how now, in the face of death, oblivious of the presence of Creon and the chorus, with no public case to make, no arguments to counter, she can at last identify the driving force behind her action, the private, irrational imperative which was at the root of her championship of the rights of the family and the dead against the demands of the state. On this issue, Hegel scholars speak of the brother-sister red herring, partly in order to affirm the incest prohibition and falsify Antigone's incestuous desires. Even Hölderlin's translations soften this issue. However these issues are resolved, and this would be too long of a digression for us to get into here, Antigone does seem to have a moment of self-discovery when she realizes that she is absolutely alone, not only rejected by men, but also abandoned by the gods. She asks, "What law of the mighty gods have I transgressed?" No divine sign comes, as the audience would expect, to confirm the rightness of her action. And she asks, why look to the heavens anymore? She must go to her death as she lived, alone, without a word of approval or a helping hand from men or gods. And yet, although Antigone vacillates here, she does return to her religious principle right before her entombment. She claims once more and for the last time that she is the champion of divine law. She suffers, quote, all for reverence, my reverence for the gods. This does make her a much more sympathetic character than Creon, who simply runs roughshod over his patriotic and religious principles in acting like a tyrant. And Antigone indirectly calls men like Creon masters of injustice. Rather than agree with her here, the chorus is appalled. Quote, still the same rough winds, the wild passion raging through the girl. And Creon, in a fury, repeats his orders to the guards to take her away quickly, and this time there is no delay. As Knox sums up Antigone's overall character, quote, this young princess is a formidable being, a combination of cold resolve and fierce intensity. Unlike Anouilh's Antigone, she has no tender emotions, except when she speaks to Polynices. She is all hard steel. Once she has made up her mind to act, no persuasion, no threat, not even death itself can break her resolution. She will not yield a point or give an inch. She hasn't learned, says the chorus, to bend before adversity. And she never does. Those who oppose her will are met with contempt and defiance. Friends who try to dissuade her are treated as enemies. Even when she despairs of the gods to whom she looked for help, she does not waver. She goes to her death with a last disdainful insult to Creon. See what I suffer now at the hands of what breed of men? Helen Morales also comments on this in her book Antigone Rising. Quote, Antigone's certainty and single-mindedness are part of her appeal, but certainty also breeds extremism, which, as Sophocles cautions, can be destructive. Today, Antigone's kind of intolerance and self-righteousness can be seen especially on social media, which tends to aggravate and inflame disagreements. Burn it down is a catchphrase of keyboard warriors. It is easier to castigate and condemn than to persuade, inspire, and do the hard work needed to bring about positive change. There is a strand of nihilism in Sophocles' play Antigone that we would do well to reject. And on the tragic outcome of this drama, she goes on, Haemon, who is Creon's son and Antigone's fiancé, kills himself, and his death leads to the suicide of Queen Eurydice. Creon is left a broken man, but at what cost? As a script for successful activism, the story leaves quite a bit to be desired. Knox comments on the tragic outcome. Antigone asked the gods to punish Creon if he was wrong, and they have, but the will of the gods remains mysterious. The gods told Creon he was wrong, but it is noticeable that Tiresias, their spokesman, does not say Antigone was right. He does not praise her. In fact, he does not even mention her. At lines 10:17 to 18, Antigone was ready to admit, if the gods did not save her and she suffered death, that she was wrong. These words may suggest that she hung herself not just to cut short the lingering agony of starvation and imprisonment, but in a sort of existential despair. Why did the gods not save her since they approved her action? Was it because her motives were too narrow? Her total indifference to the city and its rights an offense to heaven? Because, to use George Eliot's phrase, she did the right thing for the wrong reason? A Sophoclean fragment suggests that this mysterious absence of a final resolution is part of his dramaturgy. Since the gods conceal all things divine, you will never understand them, not even if you go searching to the ends of the earth. Knox observes from this how the gods do not praise Antigone, nor does anyone else in the play, except the young man who loves her so passionately that he cannot bear to live without her. Haemon tells his father what the Thebans are saying behind his back, the murmurs in the dark, that Antigone deserves not death, but a glowing crown of gold. And this is, for Knox in his conclusion, a timely reminder of Antigone's heroic status. In the somber world of the play, against the background of so many sudden deaths and dark mystery of the divine dispensation, her courage and steadfastness are a gleam of light. She is the embodiment of the only consolation tragedy can offer, that in certain heroic natures, unmerited suffering and death can be met with a greatness of soul, which, because it is purely human, brings honor to us all. Let's look now to a few other more contemporary approaches. As the abundant monographs and edited volumes of feminist interpretation of Antigone show, her character has become a battleground for more or less any topic or tradition you could think of. The range of topics related to Antigone, covered in this one volume, Feminist Readings of Antigone, edited by Fanny Soderbach, is staggering. Female subjectivity and sexuality, questions of race and gender, the role and place of the body in our culture, the tension between and interdependence of the private and the public spheres, ethical and moral conduct, the possibility of a different future, the misogyny or feminism of preeminent thinkers such as Jacques Lacan or Hegel, kinship, reproduction, and maternal origins, the emancipatory status of art and aesthetics, and the list goes on and on. For Tina Shanter, in her excellent book, Who's Antigone? The Tragic Marginalization of Slavery, Antigone, as a symbol, fights against all exclusionary logic, gender, sexuality, race, class, nationality, or religion. Shanter's book explores how the figure of Antigone has been enlisted wherever others have been identified as the constitutive outside of the political. And she particularly explores examples in apartheid South Africa, where many adaptations of Antigone have focused on a heroine fighting against segregation. Critchley is helpful in beginning his discussion of Antigone not from Sophocles but from Aeschylus's earlier Seven Against Thebes. In Seven Against Thebes, Antiochus, the son and brother of Oedipus, acts like a good democratic ruler. At another moment, his daimon recalls him to bloodthirsty blood conflict and the consequences of dark family prophecy, and the play might have been called Antiochus Tyrannus. Antigone in that play finds in Ismene an accomplice rather than a cautious conventionalist. As usual, Antigone's story skirts between divine law, Polynices must be buried, and human law, the state rules against it. Here Antigone declares, I will bury him, and I am not ashamed of this anarchical act of disobedience to the city. And she adds powerfully, strange thing is the common blood, Deinon to koinon. As Critchley comments, incidentally, Deinon is the word at the heart of Heidegger's reading of the Antigone, which he renders as das Unheimlich, the uncanny. Rather than unanimous in putting Antigone to death, Aeschylus's chorus is divided in its judgment on Antigone. A bit later, in his account of sex and gender in Greek tragedy, Critchley follows Nicole Laureau, a student of Renan and Vidal-Naquet, in pointing out that the figure of Antigone raises the question of what glory is available to women, given the glory that surrounds the heroic male death, like the suicide of Ajax or the transfiguration of Oedipus. The paradox is that for a woman's death to be glorious, it must be manly. Both Clytemnestra and Antigone are described as manly women because of their assertiveness and rebelliousness. As Laureau writes, the woman in tragedy is more entitled to play the man in her death than the man is to assume any aspect of woman's conduct, even in the manner of his death. As Critchley understands this, quote, far from seeing figures like Antigone as one-faceted feminist heroes, say for example in Brecht's 1948 retelling of the story, where she is an anti-fascist freedom fighter, for Laureau there is a deep and abiding ambiguity in the tragic representation of gender. There must have been an ambiguous thrill to the catharsis when, during a tragic performance, male citizens watched with emotion the suffering of these heroic women, represented on stage by other male citizens dressed in women's clothing. Women's glory in tragedy was an ambiguous glory. As Critchley goes on to point out, we don't know if women were in attendance at Greek tragedy. Many say at best a high priestess or two. But we do know that tragedy was a regime of queerness, where men, especially young men, dressed up as and played women. We also know that some foreigners, resident aliens, and slaves were in attendance, but the evidence for women is inconclusive. They certainly could not write, produce, perform, or judge the plays. And so Critchley asks what was taking place in this male performance of femaleness in characters such as Medea, Cassandra, Antigone, Alcestis, and the rest. In her excellent book, Greek Tragedy, Suffering Under the Sun, Edith Hall explores why women in tragedy are so often portrayed in the duality of virgins and wives. Classical Athens was a xenophobic, patriarchal, imperialist society based on slaveholding and imperial tribute, yet the figures who are silenced in the public realm are represented in the fictions of the theater, as if the democracy that was denied to those figures publicly is somehow extended to them theatrically. Women are multiple in tragedy: young daughters, older daughters, wives, aging widows, murderesses, and exemplars of virtue. But the basic contrast is between virgins and wives. And Antigone's character is all about this, a tragic virgin who laments never having become a wife. And there is also a clear tendency in tragedy towards plots involving disruptive women, like Antigone, the message here being that women unsupervised by men are trouble. The most extreme example of feminine threat in tragedy is, of course, Medea, a murderous barbarian sorceress who flies off unpunished at the end of Euripides' play in the Chariot of the Sun to Athens. She gives a most extraordinary speech decrying women's position in society. Giving birth to a child, she says, is worse than standing 3 times in front of the line of battle. But virgins like Electra or Antigone were also trouble because of what was seen as a wild, untamed sexuality. As Hall points out, there is no historical examples of Athenian women acting like Antigone, but nonetheless, it must have been somehow imaginable. Hall makes the compelling suggestion that tragedy is polyphonic. It both legitimizes the chauvinism of Athenian power at the same time as giving voice to that which undermines it. Focusing in more on Antigone in particular, Critchley writes that she is a grieving machine, a kind of political monster, like her dad, and he draws support from Judith Butler's famous book, Antigone's Claim, which shows how Antigone's rage-filled grief is something that has always haunted the polis and its philosophical defenders, not because of some enduring truth about women, but because of the ways they figure in the building and unbuilding of power. On Butler, he writes, far from representing some pure idea of the feminine or the laws of kinship, as Antigone does for both Hegel and Lacan in different and yet related ways, what Antigone represents for Butler is the instability, porosity, and fragility of gender identity and the utterly contingent character of social relations and kinship structures. The epigraph to her book, From Hegel's Aesthetics, goes along similar lines here. Quote, they were gripped and shattered by something intrinsic to their own being. While in tragedy, norms can be queered, heteronormativity can be criticized, that doesn't mean that we are somehow free of the Oedipal structures that characterize tragedy. We are still prisoners for Critchley of the family, even a queer family. Critchley's most involved chapter for reading Sophocles' Theban plays, especially Oedipus and Antigone, ends up being his penultimate chapter, which I've also included. Quote, characters in tragedy are acted on by histories, conveyed by a story, a riddle, a prophecy, or a command. They are acted upon, yet acting. That is, the tragic characters occupy the space between autonomy and heteronomy in an experience of ever-partial agency. The name of this space is fate, which is not simply out of our hands, but requires our hands in order to accomplish it. One reason to study tragedy is to see precisely how in acting we are acted upon. In acting thoughtlessly, or in rage and hurt, we are acted upon not quite causally and not quite volitionally. And so at the end of the tragedy, Oedipus the king, once the curse is fulfilled, Oedipus becomes monstrous, becomes an exile from the city. Similarly, Antigone inherits Oedipus's curse and so acts based on a religious principle made impure by a personal motivation. She ends up acting in an almost as fearsomely crazy way as Oedipus himself. She is also an uncanny being for pursuing that against which nothing can avail. As Hölderlin puts this in his notes on tragedy, which Critchley cites, Oedipus moves from the monstrosity of the union with the god to that of abject ejection from the city, where all that counts for identity is stripped away from him. Correlatively, Antigone begins as a patriotic political monster, queenly, noble, rebellious, and worthy. But her manic lucidity of truth in standing with the unwritten divine law leads her away from all human community and into the unwritten wilderness of the dead. And with this we can segue to Hölderlin's notes on Oedipus and notes on Antigone, which you can find in the modules for this week. Now, Critchley never says a critical word, at least not directly, about Hölderlin's interpretations of tragedy. When he does quote him, it is approvingly. This may be a little odd, as there is much in Hölderlin's Poetics of the Tragic that goes counter to Critchley's de-emphasis of Dionysus, which Hölderlin centralizes and calls the aorgic, and Hölderlin's thinking also moves against Critchley's de-distancing of the Greek from the modern attitude. Lastly, far from demoting a speculative concept of the tragic, Hölderlin's theoretical remarks on tragedy seem driven by precisely such a will to speculation. In his chapter From Philosophy Back to Theatre, we learn how Critchley is able to maintain appreciation for Hölderlin on tragedy, while also brushing those elements that problematize his approach under the rug. It seems that Critchley gets his Hölderlin mostly from Philip Lacula Barth, who attempts to liberate Hölderlin from the grip of Heidegger's reading, and more importantly, to liberate the theatrical experience of tragedy from what we might call the anti-theatricalism of a certain idealist reception of tragedy in Schelling, Hegel, Nietzsche, and others. For Critchley, Heidegger's Hölderlin, like his interpretation of tragedy, is vague and or radically depoliticized, and Heidegger is a constant target in his asides. We'll address these issues in the next lecture. The part of Hölderlin's approach that Critchley approves is Hölderlin's basic question, not what does a tragedy mean, but how do I make a tragedy? This would seem confirmed at the outset of Hölderlin's notes on Oedipus. It would be good to secure our poets to a proper position in society if we also, whilst taking account of the difference in the times and conditions, were to elevate poetry to the mechane of the ancients. So Hölderlin wants to figure out how we moderns can do a tragedy, the mechanics of it. So what do Hölderlin's notes on Oedipus and Antigone go on to tell us here? First of all, Hölderlin's account of the mechane, the mechanics of Greek tragedy, and its calculable law, he explains in the Oedipus and the Antigone. These are dramas which are all about a moment of caesura, interruption or break, and its tragic transport or ecstasy. For Hölderlin, in both Antigone and Oedipus, the caesura, break, or interruption is constituted by the speeches of Tiresias, because he speaks the truth. And so it is these Tiresian revelations that drive the tragic transport and its accompanying rhythms. In Oedipus, the caesura occurs near the beginning in the argument with Tiresias, and the action is torn along towards the tragic ending, Oedipus's self-blinding. In Antigone, the caesura occurs near the ending, as Tiresias announces his oracle to Creon, and constitutes a compression of the actions which took place at the beginning, Antigone's burial of Polynices. Hölderlin's basic characterization of the character of Oedipus is this. He interprets the oracles too infinitely and is tempted towards the nephas. Nephas here being his discovery of his own unspeakable crimes as something not to be done, but also as something not to be said or discovered. Interestingly for Hölderlin, the oracle of Apollo doesn't specify that the disgrace to be exposed and purged has anything to do with the murder of Laius. It was Oedipus who drove Creon to think or to declare that the miasma or pollution is connected with the unsolved case of the death of Laius. Steiner considers this to be textually ungrounded, but it's an interesting supposition. The oracle from Delphi demanding a cleansing for the city could have been interpreted more generally. Oedipus's nephas, or veering towards the unspeakable, is expressed in his basic character trait, which is his crazed quest for a consciousness of things that would be better off left hidden. And here Oedipus is a victim of his own drive to knowledge, a drive which provokes itself to know more than it can bear or grasp. After hearing from Tiresias that he is the pollution he seeks, he becomes unsure and immoderate in anger, German Zorn. And from this point forward only follows the tearing rapacity of time. In his speeches with Jocasta, Oedipus displays sad calm, the simplicity, pitiable and naive mistake of a powerful man. And this mistake is his mad quest and hope that he may be able to exonerate himself. He attempts to gain control of this manic state which is leading to his ruin when he hears that Polybus has died and not from Oedipus's hands, but then he re-begins his insane searching even against Jocasta's dire warnings. His fate ends up lying in the hands of the witnesses who are his servants. A bit more on Hölderlin's use of the term nephas, which will turn up also in his interpretation of Antigone. We find this word in the English nefarious, and most basically it comes from Latin nefas, or what is not to be done, i.e. a crime, but can also mean nefas, what is not to be spoken, the unspeakable. David Farrell Crowell, in his introduction to The Death of Empedocles, a mourning play, writes that by extension, or perhaps originally, nephas refers to religious mysteries that dare not be shared with the uninitiated. In Hölderlin's usage, nephas surely has to do with an excess of intensity, the too much, that characterizes the tragic hero and all tragic unification. Oedipus and Antigone both display this nephas, or too muchness. As Joachim Schmidt notes, nephas is approached each time a mortal moves towards the infinite, unbounded or indeterminate, das Unendlich, in thought or action. One might add, Krell goes on, that the nephas is broached each time a mortal, waxing aorgic, or waxing with too much Dionysiac intensity, tantalizes the gods, whether intentionally or inadvertently. In tragedy, as we hear in Aristotle's Poetics, hubris, translated here as self-aggrandizement, is the hamartia, or tragic flaw, that brings about the nephas. For example, in Hölderlin's play, Empedocles' nephas is the heresy of declaring himself to be a god, a little like Oedipus declaring to be able to speak with the voice of Apollo, or Antigone believing she can defy the laws of the city. More generally, Oedipus's nephas is his arrogant affirmation of his own intelligence, his underestimation of the Sphinx, and his plummeting of Thebes into the vortex of his manic search. Antigone's nephas is, in contrast, her belief that she has privileged access to the eternal unwritten laws of the gods, and so buries her brother by divine right. More simply, her nephas is her very identity as the daughter and sister of Oedipus, and thus her impossible mourning. According to the third section of Hölderlin's notes on Oedipus, he begins in abstract and monstrous unity with the divine, Apollo or Zeus, and the power of nature, the Sphinx, whose riddle he solves, but ends up infinitely and concretely separated off from the divine and the human, becoming an outlaw, anomos. This process of infinitely and concretely separating Oedipus from the divine and the human, Hölderlin reads in all the choruses and dialogues, which are all about dislimitation. quote, everything is speech against speech which mutually cancel each other out, and hence in the various scenes, the fearfully ceremonial forms, the drama like a trial for heresy, it is a language for a world where, in a leisurely age, but amidst plague and confusion of the mind, and a universally reawakening spirit of prophecy that is a return to the religious, God and man still communicate in the all-forgetting form of unfaithfulness. In short, for Hölderlin, Sophocles' Oedipus is all about retaining a memory of the divine precisely by enacting a tragic unfaithfulness to the divine. These thoughts are very difficult. In short, tragedy reveals to us a world where psychic wholeness and integrity are ultimately impossible. Within the tearing rapacity of time, beginning and end simply cannot be connected. Oedipus will never be, in the end, in misery, what he was at the beginning, in glory, for example. Nor will Antigone be by the end, in her lonely suicide in the tomb, what she was at the beginning, the princess of Thebes betrothed to Haemon, the son of the king. At a moment like this, the tragic transport, man forgets both himself and the god, and in a sacred manner turns himself around like a traitor, for at the most extreme edge of suffering, nothing exists besides the conditions of time or space. The Antigone revolves around a different nefas, the will to defy the law of the state. Creon asks, what? Dared you such a law as this to break? My Zeus is here, the chthonic Zeus of the underworld, the justice of the death gods. For Hölderlin, Antigone's decision to honor the sacred and bury her brother overwhelms her. In this overwhelming of the sacred or spiritual influx, she has to keep a firm grip on her character, and hence those moments of inconsistency. Her conflict with the law and the life of the city is what leads to her living death and suicide, which becomes a kind of self-dedication to Zeus Hades, or what Hölderlin famously calls the spirit of the ever-living and unwritten wilderness and world of the dead. Like in Knox and Hölderlin, Antigone is ever veering towards the dead. At the same time, Hölderlin's Antigone is lovable, sensible in adversity, and dreamily naive. Probably the highest trait in Antigone is her sublime mockery, which surpasses all her other utterances, insofar as sacred madness is the loftiest human phenomena and is here more soul than language. Hölderlin's Antigone, like Hölderlin's Oedipus, are mad, beset by a kind of sacred, or what Plato would call tragic mania. They simply cannot be stopped from doing what they have resolved to do, which is what makes them larger-than-life tragic figures. Horace and Creon both call Antigone's actions mad. Hers is an act of mad defiance and fury at the heart. Hölderlin is arrested before her image and says it is necessary to speak of her beauty in a superlative way, because her attitude also depends partly on the superlative of the human spirit and of heroic virtuosity. Hölderlin's interpretation of Antigone is too complex to cover fully, but the most beautiful parts of his own translations concerns Antigone's entombment scene as a marriage to death. And Hölderlin underlines, often without directly citing, the key importance of obscure mythic details in the various choral odes, especially the fourth. Having just heard Antigone's beautiful final speeches in which she several times refers to her tomb as her marriage chamber, the fourth choral ode begins with the comparison of Antigone to the mythic figure of Danae and others. Antigone and Danae were both fated for their bedchamber to be their tomb, and therein to be visited by Zeus in some form. In the case of Danae, through the golden rain of Zeus that impregnates her with the hero Perseus. Antigone and Danae are both heroic hermit-like figures who are blessed by a more chthonic or underworldly Zeus. Hölderlin does not directly interpret the rest of this choral ode, but he does suggest that it expresses the greatest degree of impartiality towards the two opposing forms of character. These are obviously Creon and Antigone. This is one of the most obscure choral odes about which much scholarship has been done, but we don't have time for it here. Let's instead bring back our discussion of the figure of Dionysus in the Antigone play. Antigone's defiant act and firm character, her having the daring both to do the deed of burying her brother and to publicly declare that she did it, is a double blinding clarity, or even tragic mania on her part, that ends up leading Creon into his own Eorgic or Dionysian ruin. Hölderlin's Antigone is an infinite inspiration that's sacredly separating itself, comprehending itself infinitely, is what unleashes on Thebes a kind of Dionysian or Eorgic fatalism, which is radically opposed to Creon's merely apparently well-ordered Apollonian organic state. Antigone strikes us as fearful, monstrous, extraordinary, or uncanny, and as superlatively beautiful in our modern context because, unlike us moderns, she has a fate. She is not fateless, merely going along with the spirit of the times and its dusmeros, or lack of fate. Antigone's reckless and daring words carry weight, and by the end, they are, in Hölderlin's turn of phrase, factically deadly words to Creon's family. According to Hölderlin, Antigone initiates a political revolution. Quote, "The nature of the action in the Antigone is that in a revolt, where insofar as it is a national matter, everything depends on the fact that everyone, being overwhelmed by the infinite reversal and thoroughly moved, apprehends himself in the infinite form in which he is moved." Implicitly, this is Hölderlin's acknowledgement through the history of Antigone's reception of an intensely Eorgic or fiery Dionysian revolution within modern consciousness. What Antigone represents, ultimately for Hölderlin, is a political return of the fire of heaven to Western reason. We don't have time to go into this too much now, but in Hölderlin's own philosophy of history, the Greeks were more Dionysian than us, more Eorgic, more touched by the fire of heaven. And this is precisely why they had to learn Apollonian definiteness and clarity, or the sobriety of the goddess Juno. In contrast, we moderns have almost thoroughly entrapped ourselves in clear conceptual thinking, in organic clarity. What we need in Hölderlin's revolutionary ethos here is to reawaken the spirit of Dionysian festivity. And strangely, Antigone's passionate intensity thus becomes for Hölderlin a kind of symbol of Eorgic or Dionysian fire, of sacred madness. Hölderlin concludes that the political import of the play is a kind of argument for republicanism. But instead of merely valorizing Antigone, he notes that Creon's formalism, or emphasis on legality, and Antigone's anti-formalism are almost too equal. We'll be looking more into the amazing entombment scene, since it's quite central to Heidegger's interpretation of Antigone, in the next lecture. To close this lecture, let's attempt to answer our question of what Dionysus has to do with the Antigone by looking to the often understudied fifth choral ode, the Ode to Dionysus. This occurs after the conversation between Tiresias and Creon, which finally convinces Creon, despite his mad outrage against the prophet, of the rightness of Antigone's claim. During these conversations, Antigone is either living, though buried alive, or has already taken her life. Creon is convinced to free her and overturn his decision, but alas, it's too late. This is unknown by the chorus, however, who sing the fifth choral ode to Dionysus in the ecstatic and deluded hope for Antigone's return to the land of the living. This ode has been variously interpreted. For some, it enacts by name the very catharsis of the entire drama, and for others, it merely consists in an extended and ultimately quite traditional hymn to the great Dionysus. Here, the choral elders are rejoicing that Creon has seen the error of his ways and hopes for a reversal of Antigone's living death, which is to say, her liberation from the tomb and perhaps renewed wedding plans with Haemon, which the chorus mentions. Knox considers this chorus ironic because such hopes are quickly belied by the tragic events to follow: the discovery of Antigone's death, Haemon and Eurydice's suicide, and Creon's exile. The catharsis actually mentioned by the chorus here is often interpreted as purifying Thebes of the pollution arising from Polynices' unburied corpse. We'll see in a moment some reasons to reject this claim. But what if this chorus sets up the retribution of Dionysus upon Creon, while also somewhat redeeming Antigone's death drive as an inverted hierogamy? We'll see in this final part of the lecture how, in Antigone's death, Dionysus and Hades, the god of the underworld, seem to be fused together. Albert Hendrick shows how this choral ode discusses Dionysus in terms of mystery initiation, such as the Eleusinian hope for a happy afterlife, which may be connected to Antigone's progressive identification with the world of the dead. The chorus concludes in Hölderlin's translation via Constantine, O you, walker in fire, leader of the dance of the stars, and keeper of secret speech, son born of Zeus, be manifest with the wakeful Naxian Thuides, who sing your choruses, their reveling lord. In his mention of secret nocturnal or dithyrambic speech, Hölderlin may be drawing a parallel between Antigone's divine unwritten law and its celebration in Bacchic mysteries. These connections are, however, unexplored in Hölderlin's notes, and so we'll utilize here two recent articles on the presence of Dionysus in the Antigone. In Dionysos and Katharsis, Scott Scullion follows Henrik in noting that the neglect of this choral ode as one of the cheerful choruses with little or no plot relevance, a euphoric presto ode that ironically precedes the report of disaster, is far from the full story. Nor is the chorus a catharsis in the simple sense of medical purgation of a plague afflicting Thebes. Because 1, this is not an attested function of the god Dionysus, and 2, Polynices' corpse has already been buried, so there is no external plague. What we find here is rather the earliest explicit attestation of the cathartic effect of Dionysiac dance upon a nosos, a species of mental disorder. And this is why the chorus equates the mental sickness of Creon, Antigone, and Haemon with the nosos of civil strife afflicting their city. In other words, this choral ode is all about healing the city body of the madnesses of both Antigone and Creon through Dionysian dance and ecstasy, and Hölderlin would agree. A note here, Scullion is the author of a very influential article, Nothing to Do with Dionysus, Tragedy Misconceived as Ritual, where he argues first that the Dionysus origins question remains open, each alternative being equally plausible, and second, that the Dionysian ritual interpretation of tragedy is not the only compelling one. So although Scullion has no bias in favor of Dionysus for explaining Greek tragedy, the Antigone is one tragedy in particular where Dionysus may play a very important role. Mention of catharsis, or catharsios, in the ode arises in terms of a cathartic foot, that is the dance of Dionysus which is associated with the healing of mental disturbance. The chorus sings, so now, when the whole city is subject to a violent sickness, come with cathartic foot over the Parnassian slope, or the groaning strait. The god Dionysus is almost invariably dancing in cultic iconography, and his dancing foot is widely attested and implies for Scullion a Greek sacral podology. The hymn is also full of traditional initiatory locations and myths of Dionysus. In this it develops very much from some Dionysian myths in the fourth choral ode. For Scullion, what we do have here is a literary reenactment of Dionysian ritual, not exactly the ritual itself, but its choral mimesis, or imitation. The conjunction of Dionysiac dancing and catharsis here involves homeopathic treatment of madness or mental anxiety, rather than the combating of an external ill, such as pollution. Scullion's treatment is extensive and goes through images of dancing catharsis in the Melampus myth in Plato and Aristotle. When Aristotle speaks so elusively of the main function of tragedy being the catharsis of the emotions of pity and fear, what he means, according to Scullion, and in the performative context of the tragedy, is the dancing chorus. The ritual cathartic dancing is what Aristotle has in mind. Simplifying Scullion's argument, it is clear that Antigone frequently invokes a range of perspectives on mental disorder or sick-mindedness. First, defiant Antigone is repeatedly called mad by both Creon and the chorus, and then tyrannical Creon and lovesick Haemon are declared mad. Most of the major events in the action, Antigone's dangerously public rather than private defiance, Creon's monomaniacal self-identification with the city itself and lawmongering, Antigone's living death and tragic suicide, and Haemon's patricidal and Romeo-esque suicide, as well as Eurydice's suicide, all result from mental disturbance and cause significant civic disorder. For Scullion, the chorus is seeking to purge Thebes by means of ritual catharsis, but the madness proves far from susceptible of ritual alleviation, playing itself out after this song in suicide and general ruination. And this is why the chorus's enthusiastic euphoria turns out to be a symptom, indeed to mark a culminating crescendo of madness in the drama. Dionysus's mental healing through the dance does not arrive, and the chorus's deluded on-stage madness is a powerful piece of dramatic irony, and at the same time, a truthful reflection of the delusion and violence going on offstage around them. While the choral ode is delusional about the imminent arrival of the coming god Dionysus and his dancing peace, celebration, and festivity, it does, in Scullion's conclusion, offer an Eleusinian glimmer of hope, confirming Antigone's hope of being reunited with her family in the afterworld. In her farewell speech, Antigone had earlier invoked Persephone, goddess of the underworld and a savior god, and Hades, and now the chorus invokes Iacchos and Dionysus, also savior gods and initiators in Greek religion. The relation of Dionysus and Hades, about whom Heraclitus says they are one and the same, hovers ominously. Will Antigone be saved by the gods in death and in the afterlife? We simply don't know. Here the chorus indulges in a premature and deluded celebration of her rescue. What is unusual is that the chorus's wish comes true, if it does come true, only in her death. Later, in being buried, Antigone is offered to Hecate and Pluto, benevolent gods of atonement and death. The anger of the appropriate gods is appeased, and the body is given a normal cleansing and burial. In short, on Scullion's way of reading the Antigone, all of Thebes is afflicted with a malady compounded of mental and civil strife, which achieves its proper catharsis only in burial. Antigone, Polynices, Haemon, and Eurydice are all buried appropriately by the end. And so we can understand the fifth choral song as sufficiently relieved by Creon's change of heart, but still sufficiently afflicted with mental anxiety and foreboding, such that they become euphoric, a form of cathartic ritual which will culminate in the feeling that Dionysus is dancing among them and cleansing their minds of their troubles. They perform a ritual of closure, but it is a false closure. When we realize that Dionysus in the fifth stasimon is credited with a still delusory or incomplete catharsis that then becomes a real and fulfilled catharsis for the city through several deaths and burials and an exile, we gain a greater insight into the religious motifs and basic facts of Greek cult that Sophocles deploys. Here, according to Scullion, we do not need to speculate about Sophocles' own theological belief. Rather, in the fifth stasimon, we are able to, quote, account for the god's role in the drama without recourse to extra-dramatic authority. For Scullion, he is not there, however, to point beyond the limits of art, to an existential realm of divinity which art can contemplate but cannot comprehend. Why is assuming Sophocles' preference for the irony of literature superior to poeticizing the limits of art precisely to point to the existential realm of divinity? We can find something like this rejoinder to Scullion in Jose Marcos Macedo's 2011 article, In Between Poetry and Ritual, the Hymn to Dionysus in Sophocles. Here, Macedo builds on Henrik's and Scullion's case but comes to different conclusions. We do not have to imagine Sophocles' hymn to Dionysus merely as literary irony or as cultic ritual, since it could have been both. Reminding of the third section of Hölderlin's notes on the Antigone, Macedo writes, "It may be said that the ideal of reciprocity between gods and mortals underlies ancient Greek religious practice and permeates most of its hymns, which are an attempt at transforming an unequal relationship in which humans are subordinated to gods into a relationship of coordination. This recoordination is how the cathartic or loosening dance can be related to Antigone's confinement in the rocky tomb as marriage to Hades, who is a binding god, as well as to the literary effect of boosting the audience expectation in her prompt release by associating her with Persephone. Recall here from previous lectures Gough's satyrs with pickaxes, which he derived from Jane Harrison on Dionysiac iconography. The satyrs are attacking the tombstone over which a sphinx is perched in order to release the bride, the maiden, Persephone, Cora. The release of Antigone Persephone here corresponds to the chorus's invocation of Iacchos. The chorus would not bother to invoke Dionysus as Tamias Komon, master of ceremonies, at this critical moment of the drama, if such a citation were merely literary or ironic. Rather, it is here that Sophocles places the Antigone deliberately under the sign of Dionysus, and the chorus attains a maximum of efficacy, guiding its audience through Dionysus's cultic centers until reaching the site where this choral dance takes place, transforming the very stage in Athens into the stage of a cosmic celebration whose focal point is the very song they are singing. Macedo thus thinks that Servino Inwood is correct in speaking of the double identity of tragic performance. Here, a mimetic Dionysiac ritual produces for the audience a sense of cultic reality. In this choral ode in particular, Dionysus' presence reveals itself as absence, and it is Sophocles who insists on this ambiguity. As Heidegger will say in his own interpretation of the role of Dionysus in tragedy, Dionysus is the god who comes and who departs, a presencing absencing and an absencing presencing. We don't really know whether Sophocles viewed orgiastic cult with a certain ironic distance. When we attempt to assume this, we project our own prejudices for and against Dionysian states of consciousness onto Sophocles. It is, however, at least reasonable to think that, quote, a prayer to the Theban god would awake a quick response from the Athenians who sat in the theater of this same god Dionysus to watch plays performed as part of the worship due to him. So that concludes Antigone and Philosophy Part 1. This lecture has attempted to give an overview of several, although far from all, of the complex hermeneutic and philosophical issues that arise when we read Sophocles' Antigone. We've introduced Critchley on tragedy and the Antigone, and standard and non-standard ways of understanding the setup and the action, as well as Hölderlin's theories of Oedipus and Antigone, and we've also looked to the crucial, if partly frustrated, salvific role that Dionysus plays in the fifth choral ode. By exploring Dionysus and the Antigone, a picture has begun to emerge on Antigone's tragic defiance as an aorgic or unbounded holy pathos, as well as the prevalence of nosos, tragic madness, in the play. However, much in the text, how to read it in light of these preliminaries is still obscure. The next lecture will first summarize Heidegger's Antigone interpretation, itself in close dialogue with Hölderlin's, and second, see how to apply all this theoretical stuff to key passages, especially Antigone's transformative final speeches by her tomb. For now, all we can say is that Dionysus definitely has something to do with Antigone's character in the play and with its tragic outcome. See you next time for the Katharsis.